It's funny. I was intending to talk about psychodiagnostics in this episode of the Psych Survivalist, and then I realized that perhaps almost a metaphor or a cultural statement would be to go back to an event that really affected my wife more than it affected me. We had been invited to a party with people that we hardly knew, but we decided to check it out and go anyway. When we got to the party, we found a room full of people, a lot of people, and they were medical students. We introduced ourselves, and they asked what we did, and my wife said that she was an attorney, and everyone who was friendly in the beginning suddenly fled. And we found ourselves standing alone with all the participants at the far end of the room while we were alone on our own. And this was literally after we walked in the door. Of course, we left immediately, and in discussing what had just occurred, it was clear to me and it was clear to my wife that the reason for them fleeing was a kind of paranoia that really didn't make any sense. After all, she had no cases about them before them. In fact, they hadn't even graduated their programs, if I recall correctly. And more than that, she, and I for that matter, weren't looking for any reason to sue. We had no papers to serve anyone with in order to drag them into court. We didn't even know who they were. We were just there to be friendly and to enjoy the party. And anyone listening to it might think, well, of course, this makes sense. These are people who are already on the defensive because they won't want to face any lawsuit in future and may even be afraid that they would be facing one in the moment that we entered the room. Perhaps they were taught that in medical school. Maybe there was one or even a whole lot of medical doctors who simply did not like attorneys because they had been sued in the past. But don't you think that you should just sort of wait around and see what happens? Not much different from what is happening nowadays in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when people are being killed for no reason at all, and even on video you can see that they weren't doing anything to harm anyone, but were nevertheless accused of being terrorists and murderers themselves. That isn't to say that there's no precedence for this kind of accusation. It appears in the media, sometimes in comic ways and other times in dramatic, serious ones. I'm thinking specifically about Monty Python's Life of Brian, in which Roman soldiers are confronting a crowd of people, among whom is Brian, and they are seeking him out. And the response is that each of the crowd members speaks up and claims to be Brian. I'm Brian. I'm Brian. No, I'm Brian, and so is my wife. That is the comic version. The serious one is from Spartacus, a film starring Kirk Douglas as Spartacus, in which an entire crowd claims to be Spartacus, so that the Roman soldiers in that film cannot find him out in order to execute him. This scene was specifically derived from the film Spartacus and was used to comic effect, and to me, who knew both films, it was really quite funny. Although it should be known that the film Spartacus, that is the script, was written by Dalton Trumbo, who actually had to go into hiding in order to write the scripts for Hollywood after he was driven out by the House Un-American activities for the belief that he was a communist. And perhaps he was a communist, but that was no reason to treat him that way. At that point, communism in the United States was no more than a belief. So we all accuse each other of all kinds of things in order to find evidence that there's something deficient or wrong in somebody that it requires ostracization. This seems to point to the fact that many people look for an excuse to be afraid of other people, especially if they don't feel secure within themselves. Pardon me if I sound like a psychologist in saying this, but it is this tendency towards fear that keep most people away from each other rather than to freely interact and find out what they have in common. Which brings me all the way to my profession and the kind of biases that people have when they find out that I am a practicing psychologist, or at least have been recently. I have been accused more than once in the past of reading people's minds or seeing things in them that they don't see in themselves, and it makes them very uneasy for what I might assess them to be. And in fact, if they knew how I went about doing what I was doing, they might even think I was more subversive than that. The truth is that I ask a good question, but it's not to hide, but to elicit them, to draw them into conversation in a way that allows me to have access to evidence that will allow me to make a determination of what might be most helpful to them, not that would hurt them. And I have even said, don't worry, I'm not going to screw off the top of your head and look into your brain to find out who you are, things that you don't know about yourself. It's the stuff that you do know about yourself, not the stuff that you don't, that is the basis for my questioning. And it's the basis for any interaction I have with someone with whom I'm working. I would like to know how they think about things, what their experiences were, so that we can discuss it and see if we can find something more realistic to solve problems. But I think it's the issue of psychodiagnostics that's put most people on edge. The thing that makes people afraid that I will discover something that they don't know about themselves because of my ability to diagnose. I don't run around diagnosing people any more than an oncologist runs around and looks for people to diagnose cancer. A good oncologist, if they're responsible, would actually engage the patient in an interaction so that they could find out specific symptoms and how they would react to any invasive treatment. I don't think that there's very much difference between that and what I do in my profession. And when it boils down to it, I don't really give a damn about what someone's diagnosis is in any situation, but really, what I want to know is what we can do about it. I really think that diagnosis is only the beginning, and not even a good beginning at that. It doesn't really tell you all that much, even if the diagnosis is accurate. And so often it isn't. And why isn't it? I would say that it's largely because most people in my profession are looking for symptoms while I'm looking for what people actually do on the day-to-day. How do they function in their lives? How do they function with people who are in their families or friends, the people who are close to them? That may lead me to a diagnosis, of course, but also it will let me know how a person functions from day to day. It may point to a symptom of a diagnosis, but really it's the action itself that is the important piece and that tells me who a person is. I don't have to unscrew someone's head in order to make the determination. It's true in most areas of research. The real issue is about functioning in any area more than it is about actually coming up with a diagnosis. If I'm to reflect back on a previous episode, it's the real problem with diagnosing veterans is they want to give me 30 minutes in order to be able to check the boxes rather than find out how that veteran performs functionally. And it appears in many, many other areas as well. What can a person do? What can't they do? This discrimination is the thing that is far more important than putting a label on them. And I would say, what's for dinner? But more than that, and more importantly, can you cook? I mean, I would probably be far more interested in dinner in your house if I knew that you were able to cook and that you were skilled at it. It's no different in any field, really. It's all about function, not about labels, and yet we run around and put labels on everybody. I think the best example of this is what happened when Donald Trump ran for president the first time. There was a large group of mental health professionals who lined up to say that he was a malignant narcissist. I'll tell you truthfully, I had never heard the term before. So I looked it up, and what I learned was that it was introduced by Erich Fromm, a psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, and that the important symptoms are of narcissistic grandiosity, antisocial behavior, egocentric sadism, and paranoid orientation. Wow, says I to myself, that's pretty cool. I didn't know anything about it at the time I first heard the term as applied to the candidate for President of the United States. So I investigated further in the only way that I knew how to investigate, by looking into the diagnostic manual to see what it would tell me. And as I suspected, malignant narcissism isn't described anywhere in the diagnostic manual, nor was it ever described in prior manuals. And I assure you, I have almost every manual going back to the beginning. But what I did find was even more shocking, at least to me. First, let me say that the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder frequently applies to almost anyone with any other personality disorder. So narcissism, from my point of view, could immediately be dispensed with. And there are many people who are narcissistic in real life who really don't have any of the same destructive tendencies that we observe in people with the diagnosis of malignant narcissism. But then I went further, and I recognized how still another symptom that applied in this case was antisocial personality disorder, in which rules are violated and people can really be exploited and hurt, as described in malignant narcissism. And I dug still further, thinking that borderline personality disorder might further apply to the candidate for president at the time. And I saw that the symptoms here were frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation, impulsivity in at least two areas, and that I would assume is consistent with sudden outbursts of temper and tendency towards addiction and impulsivity. But the one DSM diagnosis that apparently no one had considered, and I had never heard in any other discussion, was histrionic personality disorder, in which the person is constantly attention-seeking and will act out in ways that will attract attention to themselves, often sexually, which presents us with an interesting problem. For all of us diagnosticians and fledgling diagnosticians, all of whom occupy the same space in terms of presence on the planet, does the fact that the American Psychiatric Association make a diagnosis cause it to be more reliable than a diagnosis made by a psychiatrist who is relying on his experience to make a diagnostic determination? And I would say, if you think like me, both are true, but that the most important part is the assessment of functioning. Do I really care what the label is if I know what a person is likely to do out in the world to cause harm to other people and to go to dramatic lengths to draw attention to themselves in a way that makes people say, gee, this guy really knows what he's doing. I think I'll vote for him. And a further, more interesting question for me is, why didn't anyone of the electorate, or to say very few people in the electorate, take these diagnostics seriously enough to run away from the person who is demonstrating those symptoms? It would be reasonable to think, and I have to admit I suspect, that people don't trust psychologists at all when you get down to it. And I don't really have to reach very far to think of why. At its most basic, it has to do with a lack of trust. And when I think about it, and believe me, I have thought about it for many years over the course of my life, even I believe if I'm going to a psychologist for my assistance for my life and how I solve my problems, my first thought is, this person had better be good, because I've been living with myself for a long time with the problems that I carry around. And if they can't figure out any part of that in order to be of assistance, why go to them in the first place? And then that person is supposed to turn around and tell me what is wrong in my thinking and in my actions. Suddenly, I have to change myself in order to conform to someone else's assessment when I'm struggling through the very problem that I live with every day. But even more than that, psychology is considered a soft science. That means that it does not arrive at its conclusions from direct observation the way most other sciences do. Other sciences measure and examine, oftentimes using machines, in order to see what is going on that is a problem for someone when they come for examination. With us, we have to look at how people function and assess in a large number of areas where we don't have direct observation and a direct way to measure. It's less about observing what the brain does than it is about how the brain goes about doing it, which is to say, the mind, which is a corollary of the brain, and how it acts in its environment and under certain conditions. For example, an IQ test. Everybody talks about IQ tests and whether you're a genius or not. Problem is, nobody even knows what a genius is, though they go around offering IQ tests on the web so freely, but they never define what an intelligence quotient is, or even, to go further, what intelligence is at all. That is, it takes the psychologist to introject, which is merely taking a guess as to why a particular subject is acting in the way they do, which is certainly preferable to opening up a person's skull and seeing how the thing is acting underneath that skull that causes a person to act that way. I should add that there are some exceptions to this rule that are well known, which is to say, if a person has suffered a brain injury, that they will have certain deficits that can be assessed objectively in a way that is more scientific. And even then, a lot of times, you don't even need to use any test or other form of assessment in order to arrive at conclusions about a person's personality. For example, my dissertation was in the area of career psychology, vocational psychology, and I had an objective test to administer to acquire data that would support certain personality types. I'll add to that my dissertation advisor was only having me repeat an investigation that had mostly been done many times before. I didn't say anything because, of course, I wanted to get my doctorate and I had to please him in order for that to happen. But so I did the investigation and arrived at the 6 personality types that were consistent with everyone else's results who had investigated this very phenomenon. What kind of work do you like to do? Here's a test that might assist you in finding out where your areas of interest are actually located. The funny thing is, and it was funny for me although I kept my mouth shut, was that the easiest way to arrive at the very same answer was simply ask someone what their interests were. This is the kind of work psychologists do towards their doctorate, and at least I had to do towards my doctorate. Although it's similar, it's a hell of a lot different than sitting back and watching when someone destroys an entire culture in a matter of a year because he believes that somehow a country will be improved for making these adjustments even as other people are dying all around him, or else are incarcerated for long periods of time after doing essentially nothing other than being in this country and working to make a living. You don't need to give an objective test in this situation in order to arrive at a diagnosis. Just simply watch the behaviors that unfold right in front of you. And in this case, we watch it on our television multiple times a day. Simple question. Is this person out for our best interests when he is engaging in these kinds of behaviors? And how do you know? until you find out that you can no longer afford even basic foods to provide for yourself, or pay the rent, or keep a job. So you can say his IQ is 50 or 150, say he was a fool or a genius, but the results are the same. It's not as if you need to administer a test in order to see what the effects of those behaviors are. They are here all around you and staring you in the face. But why didn't people accept that? I would say they likely were reacting to his projected sense of self-assurance that the opposing candidate didn't quite have, and that they could easily understand what he was telling them, even though what he was telling them wasn't the truth at all. It ends up functioning like a collective hypnotism, as if a mesmerist suddenly was on the stage and could capture everyone's attention in the audience and make them do whatever he wanted them to do all at the same time. You don't need a psychological test for that. Not even one that asks you to repeat person, woman, man, camera, TV. An entirely false representation of a standard psychological test to assess for symptoms of dementia, which is entirely different. More than that, as inaccurate as these items are in asking to repeat them, there are a number of other areas in which the possibility of dementia can be investigated and are assessed on this particular test. It's a very common test, it's standard, and it is generally open to the public and easily investigated. So is the President of the United States dementing or not, based on what we know about him? I'll say, first of all, we don't know because he refuses to release the results of these tests that he apparently takes on a regular basis. These are known as power tests because they are based on an assessment of what you're cognitively capable of doing at any particular time. It also can be re-administered without worrying about learning effects. That is, that with repeated administration, you'll learn how to get around the test because it is a power test, and it is actually a very simple test, as our president described. And similar to the MOCA test, the test that Trump apparently has taken repeatedly, are two IQ tests which in fact do test for cognitive functioning in a standardized way, allowing for some conclusions to be drawn around brain functioning. The best being a current version of the original IQ test, the Stanford-Binet, or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which was somewhat derived from the Stanford-Binet. These could be compared to a certain extent to an electrocardiogram or some other physical examination using a machine. Basically, it is something that is put between the patient and the examiner to determine whether or not the patient is fully functioning and adequately functioning in any particular area. The Stanford-Binet and the Ways do result in IQ results, but that's the least of their importance in terms of their capacity to provide information about a specific person. Which refers us all the way back to my play written in the 1970s about Albert Einstein, where he points to his head and says, "This thing, I don't even know what it's doing half the time." Besides being humorous, it is not an idle comment, but an accurate representation of what it means to be human. I will tell you honestly, I think, despite being a soft scientist, a psychologist, I believe that our mere existence and our ability to think and function in the world is almost mystical. For me anyway, memory is so quirky that I think of it functionally as almost being a gift from God. And don't be put off by the fact that I say almost. I think it could be very, very literal. Sometimes when I remember stuff, it seems like it flew in from outer space. But where psychodiagnostics are concerned, we can have all the objective tests that we want, but in the end, we are still drawing our conclusions from inference, what we can take from test scores and make them appear meaningful in the world and applicable to improve the individual's functioning. It's not exactly like testing for a heart murmur or anything like that. But in the end, having been exposed to any number of psychological theories and practices over the years, I found that the theories that were most applicable to how I approach my practice were first of all presented in a biography of a psychiatrist from around the early part of the 20th century, Adolf Meyer, who founded the Psychiatric Center at Johns Hopkins University. And the reason was that he approached behavior and thinking in a very methodical way over time. He would ask for input from people around him, not only the professionals, because they could observe behaviors even better than he could because they had more access to individual patients. And also I subscribe to the work of the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who introduced his theory of logotherapy, which I think in many respects is what I do intuitively. That is, he attempts to explore through careful interview of a patient rather than look for symptoms in order to arrive at a diagnosis. Logotherapy to me is a functional intervention, although I will admit that I did not study it formally and it was not introduced in my doctoral program at all. But why don't people give sufficient weight to what mental health professionals, especially psychiatrists and psychologists, tell them when they say someone is severely mentally ill and may present them with risks if elected to public office? It is largely because people can't look at evidence, the evidence that might be right in front of them, instead preferring to focus about how they react to the person who is making grand statements in front of them about what he will do for them to make their lives better. And we can see a great psychological truth here. That is that someone can say that they're going to do something and not do that at all. That's how people's pockets are picked. That's how people are sold the Brooklyn Bridge and told that they will make a fortune by putting in a toll booth. There is no diagnosis for someone who refuses to acknowledge facts, even facts that are right in front of their face. But what we can do is start working towards a society where people can get a practical education in order to be able to function more meaningfully in the outside world. That's not something that you will find in a diagnostic manual. That's something that you need to look for in the educational system to deliver to yourself, to deliver to your children, so that they have a basis of thinking when they approach the world and are confronted with those folks who want to take advantage of them. There is no curriculum for that. Even in the psychological curricula, there is no course that will teach you how to deal with a personality disorder who is attempting to take advantage of you in any variety of ways. And on this note, I will sign off and say, stay healthy and don't go crazy, because there's a lot out there to go crazy about.